Hello, everyone. I'm going to kick things off right away. I know we're a little pressed for time, so we'll move forward quickly. My name is Evan. I'm with the Permanent Mission of Canada to the United Nations. Very pleased to be here to moderate this session. Siobhan mentioned that we should be speaking in our personal capacity, but you'll permit me for some Canadian propaganda, if that's all right. So Canada is very pleased and proud to be a supporter of the MEAC project within UNIDIR. Recently, we confirmed an $800,000 grant in support of MEAC, and it's really, really valuable work across a range of policy issues that we engage on, including children in armed conflict. One of the hats I wear at the Permanent Mission is chair of the Group of Friends of Children in Armed Conflict, but also for our work on peace building and conflict prevention. I mentioned the Group of Friends of Children in Armed Conflict. We chair the group here in New York, but one aspect of Canadian policy that you may not know is that we're active in a number of groups of friends that exist at the local level, including chairing the Group of Friends in Nigeria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in South Sudan, Sudan, and Colombia, a number of contexts in which MEAC is conducting active research. And our objective, or at least my objective, is to ensure that as a government, we are trying our best to use the research that's generated by MEAC to inform our work across the board, from policy programming to our partnerships with the UN, because many UN actors are involved in the context that MEAC is conducting research in. We're not perfect, of course. We have many shortcomings on our policy, but if we do try and use this evidence-based research that's coming out of the MEAC project, I think our policy programming and partnerships will be a little bit better. I meant to frame the issue. I'm going to do it very briefly. This was mentioned yesterday at the high-level opening session, but the recruitment and use of children is the most prevalent grave violation committed against children in armed conflict across numerous situations on the UN agenda. And so it continues to be a vexing challenge for the international community generally. I know we're intended to get into the weeds, but I wanted to provide that high-level frame because year over year, the recruitment and use is ranked as the most prevalent grave violation against children. And I put that in the context of years and years of policy development, of normative development, of programming development to respond to recruitment and use. And yet we are struggling across the board, across nearly all situations in which the UN is engaged on the children in armed conflict agenda, to reduce the number of children that are recruited and used. There are, of course, great successes year over year on release and reintegration, and really important evidence coming out of that work on reintegration, including through MEAC, but also the work that the UN does on reintegration, and other actors, of course, humanitarian organizations represented in this room as well. But it is a real problem, and it's one where I think conversations like this are so valuable to getting down into the weeds of how we can try and address this issue, because for us this is a high priority. Recruitment and use has always been high on our agenda, and we want to try and really understand why these numbers are so high year over year. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand it over to our first panelist, Fatima, Yetcha, Badu. The floor is yours, please. Yes.
Thank you so much for having me. I am so pleased to talk about the use of children and youth by armed groups and their reintegration journey. Remaji had spoken in the last panel on MEAC's activities across the region, so I will be very brief here. The Boko Haram conflict goes back to 2009, when they started an armed rebellion against the government in the region. Since then, the conflict has crossed to the borders into Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. As a response to the conflict, communities had to set up their armed groups to defend themselves. Since the beginning of the conflict, children have been recruited by Boko Haram and also by armed community security actors. The map here indicates the location in which we conducted the research. In Nigeria, we are conducting longitudinal study with people who are coming out of Boko Haram and other types of armed groups, as well as non-associated community members. We are doing this through both in-person and over-the-phone interviews. I would like to add that MEAC has also conducted a survey in Cameroon, Chad, and Niger with community members and people who were with Boko Haram. We are hearing that more than 80,000 individuals have come out of Boko Haram in the last year, part of the mass surrenders. The high number does not mean that the number of actual fighters is so large. It is very likely because the people coming out include many women and children. We are working with other UN partners in the region, including UNICEF, IOM, UNDP, and the RSS Secretariat in the Lake Chad Basin. And we hope that we can help with designing an evidence-based response to what is going on right now and set the stage for a sustainable reintegration down the line. If you scan the QR codes, you will find the findings indicated in this slide. And today I would like to focus on these key findings of our research. Before I go into the important role of families and social networks, I would like to highlight how difficult it is for children to navigate the conflict. This diagram demonstrates how children are impacted by the proximity to an armed group. When armed groups are close by, children are more likely to become in contact with them. When the whole community mobilizes or armed groups exert territorial control, it can be extremely difficult for children to avoid association. Children are often forced to do chores for armed groups, and girls can be married off to fighters at a very young age. These are a few quotes that I believe are important to highlight to show you some of the different stories from different respondents. I have spoken with many girls who were forced to marry a Boko Haram member at a very young age. They are still children themselves when they exit the group and often have children of their own that they must take care of. Boys are also vulnerable in the sense that they are often forced to take up guns to fight. When Boko Haram occupies a community, they become the local government, making it almost impossible to avoid interacting with them. It is easy to think that this is mainly an issue with Boko Haram, but it is important to stress that children whose community was occupied by Boko Haram were also more likely to become affiliated with armed community security actors such as the CJTF. They might be mobilizing in fear of potential attacks. And in the wake of a Boko Haram attack, some may have been pressured to join the CSS to signal their loyalties. These are only a few stories from our baseline survey. And there are, of course, many and different related reasons why children become associated with armed groups. The names on the slides are, of course, fake, but the ages and the codes are real. These quotes demonstrate how those external pressure is influencing and sometimes forcing children to join armed groups. As you can see here, these boys joined to avoid being accused of being with Boko Haram. The threat of being accused also comes in the last quote in the slide. Being accused by the CJTF of being associated with Boko Haram could be a death sentence at that time. So it would make sense that people decide to affiliate with the CSS for that reason. Young people are expected to obey their elders and community leaders. So when those call upon the youths in their communities to join, it is really hard to refuse them. For example, if my parents or elders were to ask me to join a community defense group, refusing to do so will be seen as a disrespectful act towards them. And the consequences of being disrespectful towards elders can be a quite pleasant experience, and it will be very costly. You may have seen in one of the quotes, which is about a girl whose father was with the CJTF, and then she also joined the group as well. This shows that immediate family have a major impact on child recruitment in different directions. By interviewing children who were associated with a range of armed groups and their non-associated peers, we are able to study factors of vulnerabilities and protection. By asking the same questions to those who were with armed groups and those who were not associated, we can run regression analysis to see which factors are statistically related to being with an armed group. Children without parents are much more vulnerable to becoming associated with armed groups, which we found quite unsurprising. Girls and boys who were orphans were 43 and 46% more likely to become associated with Boko Haram. This demonstrates how families can be a protective factor. That said, if your parents are associated with an armed group, it increases your chances of becoming associated as well. This also stood out when we looked at armed community security actors such as the CJTF. Almost 20% of the respondents we interviewed who were children when they joined had a parent with the group already. Parents are not the only family members that could provide protection or motivation to joining armed groups. We have stories of children who were influenced by an uncle, for example, or an elder brother who influenced a young one to join. As I already mentioned, girls are often married to Boko Haram members, and they often have children of their own that they need to take care of when they exit the group. I think this is very important because I believe it means we have to think about specific needs of girls when thinking about prevention and reintegration. The last finding that I would like to highlight is on education. For our research, we have looked at the impact of formal education and religious education. Overall, access to formal education in the Lake Chad Basin region is very low. Of the children who were never associated with any armed group, only half responded that they ever received formal education. When it comes to children who were associated with Boko Haram, this dropped to 34%. It is important to stress that we didn't ask which grade or if they had completed. If we had, these may have lowered the numbers. This is worrying because our data shows in Cameroon, Chad, and Niger, formal education indeed had a protective effect. Across the region, it is very clear that children who had received formal education were much less likely to become associated with Boko Haram, and I will show you this in detail in the next slide. Interestingly, this was different for children who were associated with armed community security actors. For them, formal education increased their chances of becoming affiliated. I wouldn't say this is surprising. For armed actors who are deeply embedded in their communities, it makes sense that school might be a place of socialization or a place for recruitment. In one of the previous slides, you might remember one of the quotes about a boy recounting how he was going to school when a CJTF commander organized a meeting to recruit them. We also looked at religious education. Almost all of our respondents said they had at one point received religious education. In fact, those who were with Boko Haram were slightly less likely to have received religious education, 88% of them versus 97% for community security actors. We also examined the impact of having been an almajiri. The term almajiri is a Hausa word for pupil or student. The almajiri system is a system of Islamic education practiced in northern Nigeria, in which children are sent out of their homes in search of Islamic knowledge, or sometimes because their families cannot take care of them. They then become the responsibility of their malam, which is a Hausa word for teacher. Without parental supervision and without sufficient economic support, almajiris are often extremely vulnerable, and they often find themselves begging on the street to support themselves and cover their feet. Being in such a situation so young makes them extremely vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Unsurprisingly, being an Almajri dramatically increases children's likelihood for becoming associated with armed groups. This was not only the case for Boko Haram, it was also the case for armed community security actors. When respondents were asked if they were in school before they became associated with Boko Haram or a CSA, there is an interesting difference in school enrollment. Children who become associated with Boko Haram were much less likely to have been in school right before they were recruited or abducted into the group, compared to children who ultimately became affiliated with community security actors. Across the Lake Chad Basin, less than 1 in 3 children associated to Boko Haram was attending school before they became associated with the group. This finding is intuitive with the earlier finding that formal education can have a protective effect against Boko Haram recruitment. I would like to end by saying we need to understand the complexities of navigating conflict settings for children as well as for many others who live in conflict. Association takes place along a continuum of coercion. Our findings clearly show how difficult it is not to become associated when living under the control of armed groups. This can start in the family or at school. It can also come about due to pressure from the community. And all of this, of course, compounded by a humanitarian crisis in which many people are suffering from lack of income and hunger. The findings show the need to target prevention efforts not just at the individual child, but at the family and social network. A similar approach should also apply to reintegration efforts as well. Education is important for many reasons. We need to bolster access to safe education, and we need adequate analysis to better understand how schools can also be places of risk. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Fatima. I think you've left us with a lot to think about. One line that you used was that it is impossible to avoid interacting. And I think that to me, leaves us a lot to think about in terms of what that means for interventions at every stage of this continuum of coercion, and how we think about responses to the fact that it is, in some contexts, impossible for children in particular and youth to avoid interacting with armed groups. I believe our next speaker is joining us via video or via video message. So we have Dr. Jacqueline Parry, the Iraq coordinator at UNIDIR, who will be the next speaker. Jackie, you're with us?
Hi, I'm the
Great,
Iraq coordinator for MEAC, and I'm sorry not to be there in person today, but I'm very happy to share some of our findings from our research by video. So my presentation is looking at the reintegration of children from families with perceived ISIS affiliation in Iraq. So youth perspectives have played an important part in all of our research, and to give you a brief overview of the data that I'm drawing on today, I'm looking at 2 separate studies. One was completed with about 1,800 respondents, of which 69 were children, and that included some families with perceived ISIL affiliation who had displaced within Iraq and returned to their place of origin. And the second is a study of 223 residents in Jeddah 1 camp in Iraq, which you probably know is the camp that hosts Iraqis that have returned from Al-Hol in Syria. And of this 223, 40 respondents were children. Now, all children were over the age of 14, and there was an equal split of boys and girls. Just to be clear on the profile, we're not looking at children who were recruited directly by ISIL or fought for ISIL, but rather children who face stigma due to their family's status. And we aim to understand how their transition out of conflict and the experience of reintegration is affected by this perception that their family is in some way influenced by ISIL ideas or experiences under ISIL occupation, even if those perceptions are not necessarily factually correct. So the first factor that influenced reintegration was mental well-being. Exposure to violence during the war was very common, and 60% of children who lived under ISIL occupation reported that they frequently felt that they were in danger of being hurt or killed. And that's compared to 30% of those who did not live under ISIL occupation. Children returning from Al Hol exhibited particularly high rates of mental distress, and they repeatedly talked about how scared they were in Al Hol camp. And that experience seems to be really at the forefront of their minds, much more than the experience under ISIL, perhaps because of the recent nature of that experience. And you can see in the chart on the slide that although boys and girls were equally fearful in Al Hol, their fears differed. So for boys, the dominant fear was arrest and detention. They were more likely to experience violence and be targeted by security actors, which may be because boys spent more time in public than girls, or it might be that girls face stigma if they report that kind of violence, and so we don't see it in our data. Girls, on the other hand, were more concerned about harassment, false accusations, and revenge attacks. And in key informant interviews and focus group discussions, girls didn't describe violence that they personally had experienced, but instead they spoke about violence against their male family members, which again doesn't mean that they didn't experience violence personally, but it might point to the higher rates of stigma that they experience if they do report the kind of violence that occurs. And it was notable that the experience of Al Hol created high levels of stress and anxiety amongst children, and all the children that we spoke to really wanted to return to Iraq in order to get away from that insecure environment in Al Hol. The second factor that affected reintegration, and that most key informants and almost all Jeddah 1 residents really stressed was the kind of key factor undermining reintegration, was the very high rates of children that were missing civil documentation, particularly among Al Hol returnees. So you may know during ISIS occupation, children were not issued with Iraqi government birth certificates, and the state didn't recognize marriages or deaths that occurred within ISIL territory. So that means that all children born under ISIL occupation since 2014 are undocumented. We are a bit short on time today to go into details, but the report gives the thorough background of why it's become so difficult to renew documentation. And it's linked to the fact that if the father is accused or perceived to have supported ISIL and is not present, then there are a number of legal and administrative barriers, and it's very difficult for these families to renew their documentation, both within Jeddah 1 and also in areas of return. And the rate of missing documents is very high. So within the population of former Jeddah 1 residents, 75% of female-headed households and 30% of male respondents reported that at least one member of the family had missing civil documentation. And even more strikingly, 95% of female-headed households reported that their children were missing documentation, and that's versus 63% of male respondents. The consequences of missing documentation are really dire. Children cannot attend government schools, they're unable to access all government services, they cannot travel through checkpoints without documentation, and then this flows on to experiences going into adulthood. People are unable to access work outside their own village if they can't cross checkpoints, they cannot access formal employment, and they cannot get married. And so children in Jeddah 1, when we interviewed them, were highly aware of this future that was awaiting them without documentation, and they expressed quite significant anxiety about the lack of civil documentation. Particularly, they knew it meant that they couldn't attend school, and the boys mentioned that it meant they couldn't work formally, and the girls were concerned that they wouldn't be able to get married legally. And key informants often raise the concern that the social marginalization caused by the lack of civil documentation will make these children vulnerable to recruitment or influenced by armed groups in future, as well as a host of other vulnerabilities brought about by really being sidelined and not being able to fulfill your potential. So a third group of factors that influenced reintegration is children's perception of safety and their trust in institutions. So children who lived under ISIL occupation were more likely to feel unsafe after they returned, and almost half of all children were concerned about revenge attacks. So this issue of revenge was really at the forefront of the minds of many children. Children who lived under ISIL occupation had significantly less trust in formal institutions, which we measured by the expectation that their family would be treated fairly. So you can see in that graph on the slide that children who did not live under occupation were far more likely to say that their family is always treated fairly compared to children that did live under ISIL. And this lack of trust may undermine the willingness of children to rely on formal institutions such as the police once they reach adulthood, and it's likely to contribute to their feeling of exclusion from the state and marginalisation within society. So it's a really important issue to address to ensure that children and their families can make a successful transition. Two other issues. One is that children from families with perceived ISIL affiliation often faced social stigma in their communities. So the parents of families with perceived ISIL affiliation were more likely to report that teachers never treated their children fairly at school. And when we did the community survey, we found that 3/4 of parents, like ordinary parents, if you like, were not comfortable with their children attending school with children from the families with perceived ISIL affiliation. And children who lived under ISIL occupation were also more likely to report being treated poorly in a shop or a market on a daily basis. And the final factor in this category is that children who lived under ISIL occupation have weaker social support networks. 1/4 of children who lived under occupation did not have anyone to turn to for guidance, which is double the rate of those who didn't live in ISIL territory. So you can see that all of these factors kind of may compound each other and lead to isolation and marginalisation of these children. The final reflection is on the idea of rehabilitation, which is not a concept that we are advocating, and the meaning of the term is very unclear, but it did come up in surveys and interviews that community members expect that people returning from al-Hol should complete some form of rehabilitation. And so we wanted to explore what this means. The word rehabilitation in Arabic is very well known because it's also used by the government, also without a kind of clear explanation of what it means. And what we found was that local understandings of rehabilitation differed from the international community's idea of de-radicalization, although sometimes the international community talks about these things as if they're interchangeable or at least similar. But Iraqi respondents generally believed that even if some of the returnees from al-Hol used to support ISIL's ideology, they were no longer perceived as a threat. And what most people believed was that these returnees needed not ideological rehabilitation, but support to address the mental, social, and other practical challenges caused from living under ISIL and in being in al-Hol for many years. We go into this in some of our other research, but I think this is also linked to a fairly good degree of trust in the government security screening process. So people do generally believe that those who committed crimes under ISIL are not returning. So this is part of what informs this perception of the returnees not being a threat. When we asked respondents what do they understand by the word rehabilitation, they usually described behavioral changes rather than ideological change. So they would talk about people becoming more relaxed, feeling safe again, learning how to socialize again, rather than changing their ideas. And then that meant that most people felt that ideology-based interventions like counselling or religious lectures were not very relevant for this population. Instead, they were more likely to recommend activities that would help people engage in what they called normal life in Iraq. So that was things like mental health support to address symptoms of trauma and distress, renewing civil documentation for children. I mean, these are all relevant for children, but also attending school was a top recommendation. And also as they moved into adulthood, support or resources needed to get a job. And another emphasis was activities that enabled children to re-socialize or socialize again, given that in al-Hol it was really isolated and there was a lot of mistrust and fear between people. But again, the kind of key factor that was stressed across the board in areas of return and in Jeddah 1 was the need to renew civil documentation, given that it has such a critical impact on the ability of children to participate in society. And then finally, a related factor that came up in our research is that the feeling of safety and control over what happens in your future is vital for behavioural change. And respondents repeatedly said that moving from the highly unsafe environment of Al-Hol to the safer environment of Jeddah 1 was a key reason for people's positive behavioral change. So they saw that people were becoming less stressed, they were willing to socialize again, they were, dressing or behaving differently in a more relaxed manner. But for children, what was quite clear is that this sense of safety is undermined by their inability to get documents, because it puts them at risk of long-term confinement in Jeddah 1 and also means that their future is really constrained once they leave the camp as well. And so if these issues and this sense of safety remains unaddressed, children will continue to face significant barriers to a positive transition out of conflict. So that's the end of my presentation today. I hope that you get the chance to read our report, and please feel free to reach out. I'd be happy to take any questions bilaterally after.
Thank you, Dr. Parry. I appreciate your presentation. I think really welcome and appreciate the focus on mental health and well-being, both in terms of understanding the impact, but also how we can better integrate this into our responses across this spectrum. And then just between the two presentations, how much social and economic issues are really at the crux of the recruitment and reintegration problematic. And hopefully we can dig into that, but I'll turn it over to our discussant, Brigid Pfister from UNICEF. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you so much, and thank you, Fatima, and also Jacqueline for the really interesting information shared today. I think probably you heard from some of you heard from Sanjay yesterday at the meeting, so maybe some of what I'll say you'll have heard. But really, I think I want to start by saying this reflects what we see on the ground, and I think that's a key message that he said yesterday. This information that you shared, Fatima, but also in Iraq, really reflects what our teams are seeing on the ground and really points a way towards how we can program and what we need to address. Highlighting this continuum of coercion, I have the Cradle by Conflict report has been a really important piece of evidence, and it kind of started this whole enterprise, I think, or maybe didn't start it, but it was a key moment for us in UNICEF to have this report, which talks about how challenging it is for children to escape that influence. From a family perspective, from a community perspective, they're living in an ecosystem of pressure, of influence that is very, very hard. I think you were saying very, very well the respect that children need to give to their elders. For example, it's simply something that children would not do, is to reject that. They don't have that possibility. The other thing is, I noticed you talked about orphans and or children without parental care. So it's sort of the opposite problem, right? The influence of family is actually absent. And this is another risk factor across child protection, but also something that we need to work on and we need to address. How do we make sure that children are in families? Because as much as families can negatively influence them, they are the most protective factor most of the time. So this is something that we are really always working on, and I think when we talk about reintegration, of course, connecting children to their families is one of the number one interventions that we do. How do we trace those families? How do we get children, if at all possible, back to their families? But I think one of the key points that both of the presentations talked about was the safety that comes in family, but also the need for safety as being a critical aspect for children. And the need to engage families from a prevention perspective, but also in a reintegration perspective. And so programming that focuses on families and parents, but also not only parents, but uncles and brothers, as you said, who may be influential, is very, very important. Just to mention also the role of education, I think this was counterintuitive when I first heard about this. We always have said that education is the most protective factor, or one of the most protective factors beyond family. It's a site where children can socialize, learn, become part of civic life, etc. But it can also be obviously a site of actual recruitment because that's where children are found every day, right? So how do we recognize that risk in certain locations and then try to address it from a community perspective. I think that's important learning for us and means that we have to look deeply at what's going on actually in schools or in other places where children congregate, whether it's youth groups or other potential sites. So safe education, I guess, is what we want to say, right? And that's that keyword safe was in your presentation for good reason. I also wanted to mention what I was hearing in both of the presentations, which is to say the role of authorities and the fear of authorities and or of security actors potentially that may be committing violations. I think that was in the previous panel as well, really clear that can be a motivator, a tipping point, I think that was called. Those things are really important for us to actually evaluate as well from a children's perspective. In terms of the situation in Iraq, I mean, I think the other thing that was mentioned, and this is very, very true, is the issue of civil documentation as being a key aspect. I myself was working in Iraq for quite some time, and I did note, as much as this is about al-Hol, this is a problem for children who lived under the control of these armed groups, irrespective of where they were in northeast Syria or not. And it's something that we have been advocating for and continue to try to advocate for. Actually, these documents are the lifeline. And I've had discussions with children myself where that was their full preoccupation. How will this boy, a young 14-year-old, cannot move from a camp? He has no future then, and then what are the options for also female-headed households? It creates a risk of exploitation, of sexual exploitation and abuse. It creates a risk of recruitment. And so it is actually a problem that we have to address fundamentally across the board. And I think this is probably not unique to Iraq because documents, they're the lifeline for children. And so that any kind of jeopardy that, whether it's bribes that need to be paid, whether it's simply lack of process, that it's not possible, whether it means you have to travel to your village in order to do something, and in order to do that, you need to rely on the kindness of strangers. This puts you at risk. So I think this is something that as an international community, we really have to look at and continue to advocate for. I know that our teams are doing that, and from the legal protection point of view, it's exceptionally challenging, but also important. I thought I think I mentioned safety and trust in institutions is really key, and the key to children feeling safe. And safety is the thing I think we all strive for our own children. That is a preoccupation we all have. So how can we enable that for children around the world that we're working for and with? Maybe the last thing to say is just around this question of rehabilitation. I thought it was really, really very interesting discussion and distinction. I think we do get preoccupied with language that we use, and for sometimes very good reasons, but it is really helpful to hear what local communities mean by certain words, and that we don't assume that our definitions are the same definitions. But even when all of us here around these tables don't have the same definitions, I think what's helpful probably to do is to look at what the process is. What are the services that people think are necessary, and if we can deliver those, there can be greater acceptance, no matter what we call them. I think that can be a helpful thought process and a helpful, think piece for me personally, but also for all of us as we approach something, so that we can figure out how we can, create an enabling environment, and that's more supportive in the longer term. Because I think overall, the goal is to have greater peace and security for everybody, and it does start with this younger generation.
Thank you, Brigid, and thank you to our panelists. We have a lot to think about for our breakout sessions, and I'll pass it over to you, Siobhan.